Ronnie James Dio was the heavy metal vocalist and songwriter. Died Sunday, was posted on his official website and confirmed by a publicist.
Ronnie James Dio died in 2010. His studio didn't. His wife locked the door that year and, by her own admission, never opened it again. Behind it, half-written songs, boxes of live tapes from stages all over the world, untouched for over a decade. Eventually, someone had to decide what happens to a dead rock star's unfinished work. What they chose to do with it split his own fans in half and got one major metal magazine to say, flat out, that it needed to stop. Nobody expected the fight over Ronnie James Dio's legacy to get uglier after he died than it ever did while he was alive. This is the real story of what happened. The room Wendy couldn't walk back into. When Ronnie James Dio passed away on May 16, 2010, his wife and longtime manager Wendy did something a lot of people never expected. She shut the door to his home studio and simply left it alone. Years later, she admitted in an interview that she hadn't set foot back inside since the day he died. What was actually sitting in there wasn't anything at all. Wendy has said there were roughly 6 unfinished songs Ronnie had been working on with 2 of his regular collaborators, guitarist Doug Aldrich and bassist Jimmy Bain. On top of that, there were mountains of concert tapes, recordings from shows in Russia, Brazil, and pretty much every other stop on his decades of touring, all just sitting in boxes. That alone tells you something about how Ronnie worked. He wasn't a guy who considered a song finished just because it existed. Wendy has explained that Ronnie was a perfectionist, and if those final songs didn't meet the standard he held everything else to, she wasn't going to release them just to cash in on his name. That's a very different approach than what happens with a lot of artists after they die, where unfinished scraps get polished up and rushed out within a year or two. So for a long stretch, none of it moved. No posthumous album of half-written material, no rushed release to catch a wave of sympathy after his death. Just a locked room and a wife who wasn't ready to go through her late husband's last work. That kind of restraint is genuinely rare in the music industry, where a dead artist's unfinished material usually gets finished by someone else and shipped out within a year or two, whether it's ready or not. Wendy made clear that if those final songs didn't sound like something Ronnie himself would have approved of, they simply weren't going to see daylight at all, regardless of how much demand there was from fans. But that vault wasn't the biggest decision the people running Ronnie's legacy had to make. Long before any of this, there was a much bigger question hanging over his entire career, the same one that had followed him since he was a teenager. How does a kid from upstate New York end up borrowing his stage name from a mob associate? The name he borrowed from a mob boss. Ronnie James Dio wasn't born Dio at all. He came into the world as Ronald James Padavona on July 10, 1942, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, though he actually grew up in Cortland, New York. His parents were Italian-American, and his father pushed music on him early, getting him started on trumpet and French horn as a kid. By age 5, he was already performing in front of people, which is an almost unheard-of head start for a career that would stretch past 5 decades. Before any of the mythology and mysticism people now associate with him, Ronnie was actually on track for a completely different life. He enrolled at the University at Buffalo with pharmacology in mind, the kind of stable, respectable career path a lot of parents in that era wanted for their kids, one that had nothing to do with stages or spotlights. Music kept pulling at him harder, though, and by the late 1950s, he'd made his choice. That's also when he picked his new name. He took the name Dio, the Italian word for God, and the inspiration behind it wasn't some grand religious statement. It came from Johnny Dio, a real mob figure from that era whose name Ronnie borrowed simply because it stuck with him. It's a strange detail people rarely bring up. One of heavy metal's most mystical, otherworldly figures picked his stage name off a mobster, not a myth. His first real bands leaned nothing like what he'd eventually become known for. Groups like Ronnie and the Red Caps were rockabilly and doo-wop outfits, a world away from dragons and demons, playing the kind of small club circuit that barely paid enough to keep gas in the car. It wasn't until he formed the band Elf that his sound started drifting toward the heavier rock that would define the rest of his life, and that shift caught the attention of someone who was about to change everything. What's easy to miss is just how long that grind actually was. By the time Rainbow came calling, Ronnie had already spent close to 2 decades working small clubs and low-budget bands, which is part of why he never treated fame the way a lot of overnight successes do. The friendship that quietly came apart on stage. In 1975, former Deep Purple guitarist Ritchie Blackmore invited Ronnie to front a brand new project called Rainbow. On paper, it was a strange combination. Blackmore's guitar work leaned toward classical influences, while Ronnie brought a taste for fantasy and mythology into the lyrics. Somehow, it worked, and Rainbow became one of the more distinctive bands in the early heavy metal scene, with Ronnie's operatic vocal range carrying songs that sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. The partnership didn't last, though, and the reason wasn't a dramatic public blow-up. Rainbow released albums like Rainbow Rising and Long Live Rock and Roll during this stretch, and Ronnie's operatic delivery, paired with lyrics about wizards, dragons, and rainbows in the dark, became the band's whole identity. But Blackmore's musical direction started shifting toward a more commercial, radio-friendly sound heading into the album Down to Earth. And Ronnie, whose entire appeal was built around the fantastical and the mythic, didn't fit where Blackmore wanted to take the band. Rather than one explosive fight, it was more of a slow mismatch. 2 guys who'd built something great together, realizing they wanted different things from it. By the time Down to Earth came out in 1979, Ronnie was already gone from Rainbow, replaced by a different vocalist entirely. For a lot of bands, that kind of quiet split would be the end of the story. A talented singer gets pushed out of a band once the sound shifts, and that's usually where the trail goes cold. For Ronnie, it wasn't the end of anything. It turned out to be the beginning of the biggest opportunity of his entire career, because within months of leaving Rainbow, he found himself being considered for a job that almost nobody thought anyone could actually pull off. Replacing a legend nobody thought could be replaced. Later in 1979, Ronnie joined Black Sabbath, stepping in for Ozzy Osbourne, the band's original frontman and one of the most recognizable voices in rock. At the time, this looked less like an opportunity and more like a trap. Ozzy wasn't just a singer, he was the identity of the band in a lot of fans' minds, and replacing him seemed like a job built to fail. Instead, Ronnie completely reinvented what Black Sabbath sounded like. The albums Heaven and Hell in 1980 and Mob Rules in 1981 gave the band a second creative peak, proving that Sabbath's sound could survive without its original singer, something almost nobody had predicted going in. Both records were critical successes at the time, and both are still regularly ranked among the strongest work the band ever produced, Ozzy era included. Ronnie's mythological lyrical style, the same one that hadn't fit with Blackmore's new direction, turned out to be exactly what Sabbath needed at that moment. It was also during this period that Ronnie introduced the devil horn's hand gesture, which is now recognized at metal shows everywhere in the world. According to Ronnie himself, he learned the gesture from his Italian grandmother, who used it as a superstition to ward off the evil eye. He brought it into his live shows, and it spread far beyond Sabbath, becoming one of the single most universal symbols in the genre, understood by fans regardless of what language they speak. Given how well things were going creatively, you'd expect this lineup to have lasted for years. It didn't. Behind the 2 albums that saved Sabbath's momentum, tension was already building, and it wouldn't stay behind the scenes for much longer. 2 reunions, 2 walkouts. Ronnie's exit from Black Sabbath in 1982 came down to a dispute over a live album. Sabbath wanted to release a live record, and Ronnie and drummer Vinny Appice objected to how their bandmates wanted to handle the mixing of it, feeling their contributions weren't being represented properly. Rather than compromise, both Ronnie and Appice walked, and Ronnie went on to form his own band, simply called Dio, releasing Holy Diver in 1983 to major solo success. That wasn't the last time Ronnie and Sabbath tried to make things work. In 1992, he reunited with the band for an album called Dehumanizer, but the same old tensions resurfaced almost immediately, and the reunion produced exactly one record before falling apart again. That album did leave behind one strange piece of trivia. A song from the sessions called Time Machine ended up on the soundtrack for the comedy movie Wayne's World, giving Ronnie an unlikely pop culture footnote in the middle of all the internal band drama. 2 attempts, 2 walkouts, and both times for reasons that had nothing to do with a lack of talent and everything to do with how the credit and control got divided. The 3rd attempt looked more promising. In 2006, Ronnie reunited again with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Vinny Appice, this time touring under the name Heaven and Hell specifically to separate this lineup from the Aussie-fronted version of Sabbath, avoiding any confusion or conflict with the other camp. They recorded new songs for a compilation called The Dio Years, and by 2009 released a full studio album called The Devil You Know, their first entirely new record together in decades, one that was met with strong reviews from critics who hadn't expected this lineup to still have anything left to prove. During the tour supporting that album, something was clearly wrong with Ronnie, even if nobody around him knew exactly what yet. He was in real physical pain some nights, doubled over backstage before going on to perform anyway, pushing through entire sets, while his own bandmates had no idea how bad it had actually gotten. He and Wendy had already seen a specialist about ongoing digestive issues before the tour, and the tests at the time found nothing, checking his heart and running him through a series of exams that all came back clear. So the tour continued all the way to what would turn out to be Ronnie's final concert on August 29, 2009, in Atlantic City. Nobody in that room knew it was the last time they'd see him perform live. The diagnosis that came 6 months before the end. Just months after that final show, in November of 2009, Ronnie was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The initial public statement from his camp described it as an early-stage diagnosis, and treatment began right away at the Mayo Clinic, with the hope that Ronnie would be back on stage before long. The reality was harsher than that first statement suggested. According to bandmate Geezer Butler, by the time doctors actually caught what was wrong, the cancer had already reached stage 4 and was inoperable. Doctors reportedly told the family that if Ronnie had come in for a colonoscopy even a year or 2 earlier, treatment might have actually worked. Instead, months of misread symptoms and a tour that didn't stop had used up time nobody realized was running out. Ronnie moved to MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston for treatment, undergoing aggressive rounds of chemotherapy while continuing to speak publicly about beating the illness. Despite the severity of the diagnosis, he stayed publicly optimistic, at one point vowing he was going to beat the disease entirely. In April of 2010, he made one final public appearance, showing up in person at the Revolver Golden Gods Awards to accept the honor for Best Metal Singer. For a lot of fans watching, that appearance sparked real hope that he might actually pull through, since he looked and sounded far more like himself than anyone expected after months of treatment. He didn't. Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at 67 years old, with close friends and family able to say their private goodbyes beforehand. Wendy's public statement afterward described her heart as broken, while also noting how loved Ronnie had been by fans all over the world. That should have been the end of the story. In a lot of ways, it was only the beginning of a much messier one, because deciding what to do with everything Ronnie built after he was gone turned out to be far more complicated and far more controversial than anyone expected. The decision that split his fans in half. After Ronnie's death, Wendy took full control of his legacy, continuing to run Niji Entertainment, the record label and management company the two of them had built together years earlier. She's also had to publicly shut down persistent internet rumors that she and Ronnie had secretly divorced at some point, something she's flatly denied whenever it resurfaces, insisting the two of them were together until the day he died. One of the first major moves after Ronnie passed was setting up the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund, which has since raised more than $2 million for cancer research and awareness through annual fundraising events like Ride for Ronnie and Bowl for Ronnie that continue to this day, drawing in musicians and fans who never got the chance to properly say goodbye while he was alive. A tribute album followed years later, featuring artists like Metallica and Rob Halford covering Ronnie's songs, with proceeds funneled back into that same cause. Then came the decision that actually divided people. In 2016, a company called Illusion built a hologram of Ronnie, debuting it in front of a crowd of more than 75,000 people at a festival in Germany. 3 years later, that hologram went out on an actual tour, performing alongside a live backing band made up of former Dio and Sabbath collaborators, using Ronnie's real vocal recordings pulled from throughout his career rather than any kind of synthesized voice. The reaction was brutal in places. One major metal publication, Kerrang, called the entire project awful and said outright that it needed to stop, describing it as a lifeless imitation being used to sell tickets to people who couldn't accept that Ronnie was gone, and questioning whether it was even ethical to put a digital version of a dead performer on a paid tour in the first place. Wendy defended the project publicly, insisting it was meant as a tribute and that the fans who actually came out to see it loved it. Privately, though, the numbers told their own story. The hologram reportedly cost well over $2 million to build, and by her own admission years later, that money still hadn't been earned back. Eventually, Wendy pulled the plug on future hologram tours, calling the whole thing an experiment she wasn't interested in repeating. Instead, she shifted toward using restored film footage of Ronnie from old multi-camera concert recordings, paired with special effects, alongside a live band, a version of the show she felt fans would connect with more honestly than a digital projection ever could. That wasn't the only way Ronnie's archive quietly kept resurfacing. In 2020, an old live recording from a 1986 concert in Philadelphia was pulled from the vault and released for the first time, giving fans a completely new piece of his catalog decades after it was actually performed. It's a smaller, quieter example than the hologram, but it shows the same pattern. Pieces of Ronnie's career kept emerging years after his death. Some celebrated, some controversial, almost none of it planned out in advance. In the years since, Ronnie's story has kept expanding through more personal means as well. In 2021, a posthumous autobiography built from his own notes and recollections, co-written with journalist Mick Wall, gave fans his side of decades of stories in his own words for the first time. A year later, a documentary followed, one that Wendy has said was designed to finally let people understand the man behind the stage persona, since she felt he'd been overlooked while he was actually alive to appreciate it. That same project reportedly brought her to tears the first time she saw how Ronnie was portrayed on screen. Wendy has also spoken about how tightly Ronnie kept his closest friendships outside the spotlight, mentioning genuine bonds with Judas Priest's Rob Halford and Motorhead's Lemmy Kilmister, two other larger-than-life frontmen who apparently chose their friends as carefully as Ronnie did. That friendship with Lemmy ran deep enough that Wendy was there in person just 2 hours before Lemmy himself passed away in 2015. A detail that says a lot about how small and tightly knit that circle of legendary voices actually was behind the music. Between the vault that stayed locked for years, the hologram that divided his own fan base, and everything still being uncovered and released long after 2010, one thing is clear: Ronnie James Dio's story didn't end the day he died. So if the hologram experiment is officially over, and real unfinished songs are still sitting untouched in that same studio, What do you think should actually happen to the music Ronnie never got to finish? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this unveil, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.